Before we begin, if you enjoy stories of cheating, betrayal, and revenge, you can watch even more exclusive adult-only stories on my Patreon. The link is in the pinned comment below. My name is Dorothy. I'm 71 years old, and until 2 years ago, I thought the worst thing that would ever happen in my quiet corner of Maple Street was old Mr. Higgins letting his hedge grow a little too wild. Then the Kowalczyks moved in next door, and I learned exactly how much trouble a new neighbor with an entitled streak and a total misjudgment of who they were dealing with could cause an old woman living alone. I want to tell this story carefully because I think people my age get underestimated constantly, by contractors, by salesmen, by strangers who assume that gray hair and a quiet manner mean you won't notice when something's being taken from you, or won't do anything about it if you do. I noticed, and I did something about it. It just took longer and required more patience than I ever expected a property dispute to demand of a woman my age. My husband Raymond and I bought our house on Maple Street in 1987, back when the whole street was still mostly young families and the trees along the sidewalk were saplings you could snap in half with one hand. Raymond passed 8 years ago. Heart attack, sudden, no warning, the kind of death that leaves you standing in your own kitchen wondering how a whole life can simply stop between one cup of coffee and the next. I stayed in the house afterward. Everyone assumed I'd downsize eventually, move somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable. I never saw the appeal. The house held 35 years of us, and I wasn't in a hurry to trade that for a smaller box with less of him in it. The house next door had belonged, for nearly 2 decades, to a lovely older couple, the Fintons, who kept mostly to themselves, but always waved from their porch, and once brought me a casserole the week after Raymond's funeral without my ever having to ask. When they finally moved to be near their children in Ohio, I felt a small, private grief about it. Not for the house itself, but for the specific, comfortable rhythm of having known who lived beside me for 20 years. The Kowalczyks, Brad and Melinda, and their 2 teenage sons, moved in 18 months later, after the house sat on the market for most of a year. They seemed pleasant enough at first. Brad worked in commercial real estate, something he mentioned within the first 10 minutes of our first conversation and continued mentioning, in one form or another, at nearly every subsequent interaction we ever had. Melinda ran some kind of homestaging business. The boys were loud in the way of teenage boys everywhere, but not troublesome, not in those early months. The trouble started with the fence. The property line between our 2 lots had been marked, since long before either the Fintons or I had moved in, by a low, unassuming wooden fence that ran along the side yard. Old, weathered, more decorative than functional, the kind of boundary that exists mostly as a formality between neighbors who trust each other. Raymond and I had never once disputed its position with the Fintons in 20 years. It simply was where it was, agreed upon by everyone who'd ever lived on either side of it. 6 months after the Kowalczyks moved in, Brad knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, holding a printed survey document, and informed me, with the breezy confidence of a man delivering good news, that the actual property line runs about 4 feet into your side of the yard, based on the county survey. He'd apparently had a new survey commissioned when refinancing his mortgage, and the surveyor, using updated equipment, had drawn the boundary differently than the old fence position suggested. I want to be fair here. Surveys sometimes do reveal genuine discrepancies from old fence lines, and if Brad had approached this honestly, I would have had no objection to resolving it fairly, even if it meant conceding some yard space. What actually happened, over the following months, revealed something else entirely. Brad's updated survey, it turned out later, had been conducted by a friend of his from his real estate circles, a surveyor whose license, I eventually learned through the county records office, had been placed under review twice in the preceding 5 years for inaccuracies in commissioned surveys, inaccuracies that, curiously, always seemed to favor whichever client had hired him. At the time, though, I didn't know any of that. I only knew that Brad wanted to move the fence 4 feet onto what I'd considered my property for 35 years, taking with it a strip of garden bed where I grew tomatoes and the small flagstone path Raymond had laid himself the summer before he died. I told Brad I'd need to look into it before agreeing to anything. He seemed mildly irritated by this, as though my hesitation were somehow unreasonable given his survey's apparent authority, but he let it go for the time being. That was the beginning of what I came to think of, privately, as the campaign. Over the following year, Brad and Melinda Kowalczyk made it clear, through a slow accumulation of small, deniable actions, exactly how they intended to handle a neighbor who wouldn't simply hand over 4 feet of disputed yard without a fight. They began accidentally allowing their landscaping crew to mow the disputed strip as though it were already theirs, cutting down my tomato plants twice in one summer before I finally intercepted the crew myself and explained, as calmly as I could manage, that the property line remained legally unresolved and they had no business touching anything on that side of the old fence. Melinda began parking one of the boys' cars along the curb directly in front of my mailbox, blocking my own access to it, always with some innocent explanation ready when I mentioned it. "Oh, I didn't realize that was an issue. The street's not really anyone's exclusively, is it?" A comment that struck me, given the entire dispute was ostensibly about precise property boundaries, as remarkably convenient in its sudden vagueness. Their son's basketball hoop, installed at the edge of their driveway, was angled in such a way that stray balls landed reliably in my garden beds several times a week, and my polite requests that they adjust the angle were met, each time, with vague assurances that they'd look into it, followed by no change whatsoever. None of this, individually, would have justified much of a response. That was, I came to understand, precisely the point. Brad Kowalczyk had built a career in commercial real estate around exactly this kind of pressure, small, deniable, cumulative encroachments designed to exhaust a resistant party into eventually conceding simply to make the friction stop. I imagine it worked, in his professional life, on people with less patience and fewer resources than I eventually discovered I actually had. What Brad hadn't accounted for was that I'd spent 30 years as a records clerk for the county courthouse before retiring, and that I still, 11 years after retirement, knew nearly everyone in the county surveyor's office, the assessor's office, and the local historical society by first name. The moment that finally moved me from quiet frustration to deliberate action came on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, when I returned from the grocery store to find that Brad had hired a crew to install a new fence, not along the old, agreed-upon boundary, but 4 feet into my side yard, exactly along the line his questionable survey had claimed, without ever securing my written agreement or any legal resolution of the dispute. They'd already torn out what remained of my tomato garden by the time I pulled into my driveway. The flagstone path Raymond laid was cracked in 2 places where a piece of heavy equipment had rolled across it. I did not shout. I want to be clear about that, because I know these stories sometimes involve some dramatic confrontation in the yard, and mine didn't happen that way. I stood in my driveway for a long moment, looking at the ruined tomato bed and the cracked flagstones, and felt something settle into place inside me that was less like anger and more like clarity. I walked over, calmly, and asked the crew foreman to stop working immediately, explaining that the property line was legally disputed and that no agreement had been reached. The foreman, to his credit, stopped immediately and apologetically, explaining that Brad had told him the boundary issue was already settled. I thanked him for his honesty and told him I'd be in touch with his company directly regarding what I intended to do next. Then I went inside, made myself a cup of tea, and started making phone calls. The first call was to Diane Whitfield, an old friend from my courthouse years who now worked in the county surveyor's office. I described the situation and the name of the surveyor Brad had used. Diane went quiet for a moment on the phone and then said, "Dorothy, that name's familiar. Give me a day to pull some records." What Diane found, over the following week, was a pattern I'd suspected but hadn't been able to confirm on my own. The surveyor Brad hired had, in at least 3 prior disputes over the past 4 years, produced boundary surveys that diverged significantly from the county's own official recorded plats, always, notably, in favor of whichever party had hired him. 2 of those cases had resulted in formal complaints to the state licensing board. His license was, as of that year, under active review, a fact Brad had either not known or, more likely given his profession, chosen not to mention. The second call was to a property attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Beatrice Alvarez who specialized in boundary disputes and had, coincidentally, handled 2 prior cases involving the exact same questionable surveyor. She reviewed the county's original recorded plat from 1974, when the neighborhood was first subdivided, along with the fence's documented position across multiple historical aerial photographs I was able to access through the Historical Society, showing the old fence in precisely the same position for over 4 decades. "This is about as clean a case as I ever see," Beatrice told me. "The original plat, the historical aerial photography, and decades of undisputed use all support the fence's original position. Your neighbor's survey is an outlier, and given the surveyor's disciplinary history, I doubt it would survive serious scrutiny in court." The third call was to the crew foreman's company directly, informing them formally, in writing, that any further work on the disputed property without resolution would result in a claim against the company, as well as Brad individually. The company, unwilling to risk its own liability over someone else's boundary dispute, refused to continue the job until the matter was legally settled, leaving Brad's half-finished fence sitting in ruins along my property line for nearly 3 months while the dispute worked its way toward resolution. Brad, predictably, did not take this quietly. He came to my door twice in the following weeks, alternating between wounded reasonableness. "Dorothy, I really thought we could handle this like adults," neighbor to neighbor, and thinly veiled intimidation, mentioning, on his second visit, that he had connections in local zoning who could make my life considerably more difficult if I insisted on making this a legal matter rather than a friendly conversation between neighbors. I found this threat almost funny, given that I'd spent 30 years working alongside exactly the kind of county officials he was vaguely gesturing toward, and knew perfectly well that zoning disputes require documented cause, not the vague say-so of an irritated commercial real estate agent with a grudge over 4 feet of tomato garden. "Brad," I told him on his second visit, "I spent 3 decades filing exactly this kind of dispute for a living. I know precisely how this works, and I know precisely how it doesn't work. If you'd like to resolve this fairly, based on the actual historical record, I'm entirely willing to sit down and discuss it. If you'd like to continue threatening an old woman on her own porch, I'll simply let my attorney handle all further communication." He left without a response, which I took, correctly as it turned out, as a sign that his confidence had begun to falter. The formal dispute took another 5 months to fully resolve, filed as a boundary quiet title action, a legal process, Beatrice explained, designed specifically to formally establish disputed property lines using historical evidence. The county's own aerial photographs, some dating back to 1968, showed the fence in its long-standing position with total consistency. The original 1974 subdivision plat matched the old fence line precisely. 3 former neighbors, including the Fentons, whom I tracked down in Ohio and who were happy to provide sworn affidavits, confirmed the fence's undisputed position throughout their own 20 years of ownership. Brad's surveyor, called to testify regarding his methodology, gave an uncomfortable, evasive account that Beatrice later described to me, with evident professional satisfaction, as one of the worst depositions I've watched in 15 years of practice. 2 months later, his license was formally suspended by the state board, a development entirely unrelated to my case on paper, but one that Beatrice suspected our disputes discovery process had quietly accelerated, given that the board's investigators had requested copies of several documents from our filing. The court ruled, unsurprisingly given the weight of the historical evidence, that the property line remained exactly where the old fence had always stood. Brad was ordered not only to restore the boundary to its original position at his own expense, but also to compensate me for the destroyed garden bed and the cracked flagstone path, a sum that, satisfyingly, was calculated to include the cost of restoring Raymond's flagstones with matching period-appropriate stone, since the judge, reviewing photographs of the original path, apparently agreed it held sentimental as well as material value. I won't pretend the 18 months of this dispute were pleasant. There were nights I lay awake genuinely frightened by Brad's vague threats about zoning connections, even though I understood, rationally, that they amounted to nothing. There's something specifically exhausting about being an older woman living alone, facing down a much younger, much louder neighbor who assumes, visibly, that your age and your solitude make you an easy target rather than simply an inconvenient one. What sustained me, more than anything, was the slow accumulation of quiet allies I hadn't fully appreciated until I needed them. Diane in the surveyor's office, Beatrice with her sharp legal mind, The Fentons in Ohio who remembered our old fence line with genuine fondness. Even the crew foreman who'd stopped work the moment I explained the situation honestly rather than simply following his employer's convenient version of events. 35 years in one place, it turns out, builds a kind of quiet infrastructure of goodwill that a newcomer with an entitled streak has no way of accounting for, no matter how many connections he claims to have. The new fence was installed, at Brad's expense, precisely along the original line, this time verified by an independent, licensed surveyor whose credentials Beatrice checked personally before allowing the job to proceed. My garden bed was restored the following spring, tomatoes and all, and Raymond's flagstone path was rebuilt, stone by matching stone, by a mason who took evident, careful pride in getting the pattern right. Brad and Melinda sold their house 11 months after the ruling, listing it, with what I understand was some irony lost on absolutely no one on the street, through a different real estate agency than Brad's own firm. I heard, from the new owners who moved in the following spring, a pleasant young couple with a baby on the way, that Brad had apparently developed something of a reputation among local title companies by then, a fact I felt no particular urge to investigate further, though I won't pretend it didn't bring me a small, private satisfaction when I heard it. I still grow tomatoes every summer in that same restored garden bed, and I still walk the flagstone path Raymond built, rebuilt now in his exact original pattern, every single morning with my coffee, the way I have for over 3 decades. The new neighbors wave from their porch, the way the Fentons once did, and I found myself, without quite planning it, slipping into the role of the neighbor who brings a casserole when something difficult happens on the street, the way the Fentons once did for me. I think, at 71, the thing I'm proudest of in this whole exhausting affair isn't really the legal victory, satisfying as it was to watch Brad's survey collapse under its own weight in that courtroom. It's simply that I didn't let being an old woman alone convince me, even for a moment, that I had no right to defend 35 years of my own life, my own garden, and my husband's flagstone path, just because someone louder and younger assumed I would. Raymond used to say, laying those flagstones the summer before he died, that a good boundary isn't really about keeping people out. It's about knowing exactly what's yours, clearly enough that nobody can talk you out of it. I think about that every morning now, walking his path with my coffee, tomatoes ripening in the restored garden bed beside me, in a yard that is, and has always been, and will remain, precisely as wide as it always was. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, please leave a comment and let me know what you think. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories.